The neon lights of Murphy's bar flickered against the humid evening air as Staff Sergeant Jake pushed through the heavy wooden door. The familiar smell of beer and fried food hit him immediately, mixing with the sound of pool balls clacking and classic rock playing from the jukebox in the corner. After 3 grueling months of desert training exercises, this little dive bar just outside camp had become a sanctuary for Marines looking to unwind. Jake ran a hand through his short-cropped hair and scanned the crowded room. His uniform was perfectly pressed despite the long day, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. At 28, he carried himself with the confident swagger that came from 7 years in the Corps and 2 tours overseas. His chest displayed an impressive collection of ribbons and medals, including a Purple Heart and Bronze Star that never failed to catch attention. "Over here," shouted Corporal Danny from a corner booth, waving a beer bottle in the air. Jake made his way through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces and exchanging brief greetings with fellow Marines. The booth was packed with his usual crew, Sergeant First Class Mike and Lance Corporal, all still in their service uniforms despite being off duty. "Rough day at the office?" asked as Jake slid into the booth, his weathered face showing the lines of a career military man approaching retirement. "You could say that," Jake replied, signaling the waitress for a beer. "Colonel Henderson decided we needed an extra dose of motivation today, had us running combat scenarios until 1800. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from upcoming deployments to weekend plans. Jake found himself relaxing for the first time in days, the tension in his shoulders gradually easing as the cold beer worked its magic. Around them, the bar buzzed with the typical Friday night energy, couples on dates, groups of friends celebrating the end of the work week, and scattered military personnel from the nearby base. It was who first noticed her. "Check out the brunette at the bar," he said, subtly nodding toward a woman sitting alone near the far end. "She's been nursing that same drink for 20 minutes. Jake followed his gaze and immediately understood the fascination. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length dark hair and an understated elegance that seemed out of place in the rough-around-the-edges establishment. She wore simple jeans and a navy blue blouse, nothing flashy or attention-seeking, yet there was something about her posture that commanded notice. She sat perfectly straight, her eyes constantly scanning the room in a way that seemed almost professional. "Think she's waiting for someone?" wondered aloud, taking a long pull from his beer. "Only one way to find out," said with a grin. "You're up. Time to put that Marine charm to work." Jake shook his head, laughing. "I'm not some rookie looking to impress anyone. Besides, she's probably got a boyfriend coming to meet her." But even as he protested, Jake found himself stealing glances at the mysterious woman. There was something intriguing about her calm demeanor, the way she seemed completely comfortable being alone in a crowded bar full of rowdy military personnel. Most civilians, especially women, showed at least some sign of nervousness in such an environment. She displayed none. "Come on, man," pressed. "When's the last time you actually talked to a woman who wasn't wearing fatigues? Sarah dumped you 6 months ago, and you've been married to the Corps ever since." The mention of his ex-girlfriend stung slightly, but Jake had long since accepted that relationship's end. Sarah had grown tired of the deployments, the uncertainty, the way the Marine Corps always seemed to come first. It was a common story in military relationships, one that had played out countless times among his friends and colleagues. "Fine," Jake said, draining the last of his beer and standing up. "But if this goes badly, you're all buying the next round." His friends erupted in cheers and good-natured jeering as he straightened his uniform and walked toward the bar. The woman didn't look up as he approached, seemingly absorbed in watching the condensation form on her glass. Up close, Jake could see she was even more striking than he'd first thought. Her features were sharp but feminine, and there was an alertness in her dark eyes that spoke of intelligence and perhaps experience beyond her years. "Excuse me," Jake said, sliding onto the next to her. "I couldn't help but notice you're drinking alone. I'm Jake." She turned to face him fully for the first time, and Jake felt a slight jolt of surprise. Her gaze was direct and assessing, the kind of look he was used to receiving from superior officers rather than civilian women in bars. For a moment, he wondered if she might be military herself, though something about her seemed different from the female Marines he knew. "Sarah," she replied simply, extending a firm handshake. "And I prefer drinking alone, actually. It's quieter that way." Most people would have taken the hint and retreated, but Jake had faced down insurgents in and survived IED explosions in Afghanistan. A polite brush-off from a pretty woman hardly qualified as intimidating. Instead, he found himself more intrigued than discouraged. "Sarah, that's a coincidence," he said with a slight smile. "I used to date a Sarah, though I have to say she was never as composed as you seem to be. Most people get a little jumpy in places like this, especially with all the military guys around." "Should I be jumpy?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. Her tone was neutral, but Jake detected a hint of amusement underneath. "Depends," Jake replied, settling more comfortably on his stool. "We're mostly harmless, just looking to blow off some steam after a long week, though I suppose our idea of fun might be a little intense for some people." "What kind of intense?" Sarah asked, taking a small sip of what appeared to be whiskey neat. Jake gestured toward his table of friends, who were now openly watching the interaction with barely concealed interest. "Well, over there once arm wrestled a Navy SEAL and won. Can drink anyone under the table and still run a 6-minute mile the next morning. And, well, his main talent is getting us into trouble and then talking our way out of it." "And what about you?" Sarah asked. "What's your special talent, Jake?" The question caught him slightly off guard. Most civilian women wanted to know about his tour overseas, his medals, or his job in general terms. They rarely asked about his specific skills or abilities, perhaps sensing that the answers might be more serious than they were prepared to handle. "I'm good at reading people," Jake said after a moment of consideration. "Knowing who to trust, who's dangerous, who's hiding something. It's kept me alive in some pretty rough places." "Interesting," Sarah said, her expression giving nothing away. "And what do you read when you look at me?" Jake studied her carefully, his training automatically cataloging details. The way she held herself suggested physical fitness and possibly martial arts training. Her hands showed no calluses from manual labor, but had small scars that could indicate weapons handling. Most telling was her constant awareness of the room around them, the way her eyes tracked movement without her head turning. "I think you're not what you appear to be," Jake said finally. "You're comfortable in situations most people wouldn't be. You're assessing everyone who comes near you. And you're definitely not intimidated by a room full of Marines, which tells me you've dealt with military personnel before." For the first time since he'd approached her, Sarah's composed facade cracked slightly. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, and Jake caught a glimpse of what might have been approval in her eyes. "Not bad," she said, "though you missed a few things." "Such as?" "That's for you to figure out," Sarah replied, finishing her whiskey and setting the glass down with a soft clink. "But I'm curious about something. You introduced yourself with just your name, but your friends over there have been calling you by rank all evening. What should I call you?" Jake realized she was right. In his attempt to seem casual and approachable, he'd forgotten the military habit of using ranks and call signs in social situations. Among Marines, it was a sign of respect and brotherhood that extended beyond duty hours. "Staff Sergeant technically," he admitted, "but most people just call me, though in the field I go by Hammer." "Hammer?" Sarah asked, and this time her amusement was clearly visible. "For my subtle approach to problem-solving," Jake explained with a self-deprecating grin. "When something needs fixing, I tend to hit it until it works." "And does that approach work with women too?" Sarah asked. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Jake wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. Before he could formulate a response, Sarah stood up and placed a $20 bill on the bar, more than enough to cover her drink and a generous tip. "This has been enlightening, Staff Sergeant," she said, gathering her small purse. "But I should be heading home." "Wait," Jake said, standing as well. "I never got to ask what should I call you. I mean, besides Sarah, everyone's got a nickname or call sign these days." Sarah paused, looking at him with that same assessing gaze she'd worn throughout their conversation. For a moment, Jake thought she might not answer, that she would simply walk away and leave him with more questions than answers. "Black Mamba," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the bar's background noise. Jake felt his blood run cold as the words registered. Every Marine worth his salt knew that call sign, had heard the stories whispered in barracks and briefing rooms across the globe. Black Mamba wasn't just any nickname. It belonged to one of the most lethal and mysterious operators in the special operations community. Someone whose real identity was classified so far above his pay grade that even acknowledging the name could be career-ending. He stared at Sarah, at Black Mamba, as she calmly walked toward the exit, her movement fluid and controlled in a way that suddenly made perfect sense. The confidence, the awareness, the complete lack of intimidation in a room full of warriors. She wasn't just comfortable around military personnel, she was one of them. And not just any of them, but potentially one of the most dangerous people he would ever meet. As the door closed behind her, Jake realized he was still standing frozen by the bar, his mouth slightly open in shock. The legendary Black Mamba had been sitting 3 feet away from him for the better part of an hour, and he'd been treating her like any other woman he might pick up in a bar. Called from their booth, "How'd it go? She shoot you down?" Jake slowly made his way back to the table, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. His friends looked at him expectantly, ready to either celebrate his success or console him in defeat. Instead, Jake slumped into his seat and stared at the tabletop, trying to process the encounter. "She told me her call sign," he said finally. "Oh man, she's military?" asked, perking up with interest. "What unit? What's her call sign?" Jake looked up at his friends, all seasoned Marines who had served in combat zones around the world. They would understand the significance better than anyone, would grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Black Mamba," he said quietly. The table fell silent immediately. His beer bottle stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes widened in recognition and looked confused but sensed the gravity of the moment. "You're joking," said after a long pause. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Jake replied. The silence stretched on as the implications sank in. Black Mamba wasn't just a legendary operator. She was a ghost, someone whose very existence was the subject of debate in intelligence circles. Some believed the call sign belonged to multiple people, a rotating cast of elite operatives. Others insisted it was one person whose skills bordered on the supernatural. "Holy shit," whispered finally. "The Black Mamba was just sitting here drinking whiskey like any other person." "What did you say to her?" asked, finally catching up to the situation's significance. Jake rubbed his face with both hands, replaying every moment of their conversation. "I treated her like a civilian. I talked about reading people and being good in combat zones. I told her my call sign was hammer because I hit things until they work." Despite the seriousness of the moment, let out a low chuckle. "Well, at least you didn't try to impress her with war stories. Something tells me her stories would make ours look like bedtime tales." As Jake sat there surrounded by his friends, he realized that his encounter with Sarah, with Black Mamba, had changed something fundamental about how he saw himself and his place in the military hierarchy. For years, he'd carried himself with the confidence of a proven warrior, someone who had faced danger and emerged victorious. But meeting someone who operated on an entirely different level had been a humbling experience that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he inhabited. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of routine training exercises and paperwork, but Jake found himself unable to shake the memory of his encounter with Sarah. Every quiet moment brought back the image of her calm demeanor and the shock of learning her true identity. He'd tried researching Black Mamba through official channels, but every inquiry hit a wall of classified restrictions and need-to-know protocols that his security clearance couldn't breach. "You're being weird," observed during their morning PT run around the base perimeter. "Ever since that night at Murphy's, you've been distracted. What's eating at you?" Jake maintained his pace, his breathing steady despite the grueling tempo had set for their group. The morning air was crisp and clean, a welcome change from the previous day's oppressive humidity. Around them, other Marines conducted their own physical training, the base coming alive with the familiar rhythm of military life. "I keep thinking about what she said," Jake admitted, his footsteps pounding against the asphalt in rhythm with his friends. "About missing things when I was reading her. What kind of details does someone like that notice that I completely overlooked?" "Maybe she was just messing with you," suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't really believe it. "Psychological warfare and all that, keep the enemy guessing." "Were you the enemy, though?" asked, slowing his pace slightly as they approached the halfway point of their run. "From what you described, she seemed more curious than hostile, like she was testing you rather than trying to intimidate you." The observation stuck with Jake throughout the rest of their run and continued to nag at him during the day's training exercises. Colonel Henderson had scheduled a series of urban combat simulations, and Jake found himself approaching each scenario differently, trying to see beyond the obvious tactical considerations to the subtler elements he might have missed before. During the lunch break, Jake sat alone in the mess hall, picking at his food while reviewing the morning's performance. He'd noticed details he'd previously overlooked, the way shadows fell across certain positions, the ambient sounds that could mask or reveal movement, the psychological impact of different approach routes on both attackers and defenders. "Mind if I join you?" asked Captain Lisa Williams, sliding her tray across from Jake's before he could respond. Williams was one of the few female officers on base, an intelligence specialist who had earned universal respect through her analytical skills and no-nonsense approach to her work. "Free country," Jake replied, though he wasn't particularly in the mood for conversation. Williams studied him for a moment before speaking. "Word around the base is that you've been asking questions about classified operators. That's a dangerous rabbit hole, especially for someone at your pay grade." Jake looked up sharply, surprised that his inquiries had attracted attention. "I'm not trying to compromise operational security. I just had an encounter that got me thinking about things differently." "What kind of encounter?" Williams asked, her tone shifting from casual to professional. Jake hesitated, uncertain how much he should reveal. Williams had a reputation for discretion, and her intelligence background might give her insights he couldn't access through normal channels. But discussing classified call signs, even with a superior officer, carried risks he wasn't sure he wanted to take. "Let's say I met someone who made me realize how much I don't know about the world I think I operate in," Jake said carefully. Williams nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That can be a hard lesson to learn, especially for someone with your background and achievements, but it's also a valuable one if you handle it correctly." "What do you mean?" "There are levels to this business. You're good at what you do, very good. Your record speaks for itself. But there are people operating at levels most of us can't even imagine. People whose existence challenges everything we think we know about warfare, intelligence, and human capability." Jake felt a chill of recognition at her words. "You know about Black Mamba?" William's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, her eyes narrowing as she processed his statement. For a long moment, the noise of the mess hall seemed to fade into the background as she stared at him. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked quietly. "From Black Mamba herself," Jake replied, deciding that honesty was his best option. "3 weeks ago at Murphy's bar." Williams set down her fork completely, leaning back in her chair as if physically distancing herself from the conversation. "You're telling me you had a conversation with someone who claimed to be Black Mamba in a civilian bar?" "I'm telling you I had a conversation with someone who revealed that call sign after I'd spent an hour trying to figure out what was different about her," Jake corrected. "Someone who carried herself like she could take apart everyone in that room without breaking a sweat." "Describe her," Williams said, her voice taking on the crisp tone of a formal intelligence briefing. Jake provided every detail he could remember: Sarah's appearance, mannerisms, the way she'd assessed the room, her complete lack of intimidation despite being surrounded by Marines. Williams listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. "The woman you're describing matches intelligence profiles we've seen," Williams said finally. "But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. There are a lot of highly trained women in the special operations community, and some of them use that particular skill set in civilian environments." "But," Jake pressed, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. Williams was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing her words carefully. "There have been reports over the years. Unconfirmed mission results that didn't match the stated personnel involved, operations that succeeded in ways that shouldn't have been possible with the resources allegedly deployed." "What kind of operations?" "The kind that never officially happened," Williams replied cryptically. "High-value target eliminations, intelligence extractions, situation resolutions that required someone with capabilities beyond normal special operations training." Jake felt his pulse quicken as the implications became clearer. "You're talking about someone who operates outside the normal command structure." "I'm talking about someone whose existence is a matter of national security," Williams corrected firmly. "Someone whose identity, location, and activities are classified at the highest possible levels. If you really did encounter this person, you need to be very careful about who you discuss it with and how you proceed." The warning was clear, but Jake found himself more intrigued than deterred. What would someone like that be doing drinking alone in a bar near camp? Could be anything, Williams said, gathering her tray to leave. Rest and recreation, surveillance, meeting a contact, or just living their life between assignments. People like that don't stop being human just because they're exceptional at what they do. As Williams walked away, Jake was left with more questions than answers. The official confirmation that Black Mamba was real, combined with the warning about the sensitivity of the topic, only intensified his curiosity about Sarah and what her presence might mean. That evening, Jake found himself driving back to Murphy's bar despite his friends teasing about his obsession with the mystery woman. The bar was less crowded on a Tuesday night, with only a handful of regulars nursing their drinks and watching the baseball game on the mounted televisions. Sarah wasn't there, but Jake hadn't really expected her to be. Instead, he took the same stool where he'd first approached her and ordered a beer, trying to replay their conversation from her perspective. What had she seen in him that he'd missed? What details had given away more than he'd intended to reveal? "You're the Marine who talked to Sarah last month," observed the bartender, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd apparently been working at Murphy's since before Jake was born. "You know her?" Jake asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "She comes in every few months," the bartender replied, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Always sits in the same spot, always orders the same drink, always leaves the same tip. Polite, but keeps to herself mostly." "Did she say anything about me after I left that night?" The bartender smiled knowingly. "She asked if you were a regular. When I told her you came in with your buddies most Friday nights, she seemed to find that interesting. Then she asked about the base schedule, when units deploy, when new personnel rotate in, that sort of thing." Jake felt a chill of realization. She was gathering intelligence. "Maybe," the bartender said with a shrug. "Or maybe she was just curious about the local military presence. Hard to tell with someone like her." "Someone like her?" "The kind of person who notices everything but reveals nothing," the bartender explained. "I've been serving drinks for 30 years, seen all kinds come through here. Most people you can read their story in 5 minutes. But Sarah, it's like looking at a locked safe. You know there's something valuable inside, but you'll never know what without the right combination." Jake spent the next hour nursing his beer and thinking about the bartender's words. The idea that Sarah had been conducting surveillance on him and the base was both disturbing and oddly flattering. It suggested that their encounter hadn't been the random meeting he'd assumed, but rather a calculated interaction with a specific purpose. When he finally left the bar, Jake made a decision that would prove to be either very smart or very dangerous. Instead of driving straight back to base, he took a detour through the nearby residential neighborhoods, looking for any sign of Sarah's presence. He had no idea what kind of vehicle she might drive or where she might be staying, but something compelled him to search. It was in a quiet subdivision about 10 minutes from the bar that he spotted her. She was sitting in a dark sedan parked under a streetlight, apparently watching a house across the street. Even from a distance, Jake could recognize her silhouette and the alert way she held herself. He drove past without slowing, his mind racing with implications. If Black Mamba was conducting surveillance in a civilian neighborhood near a military base, it could mean anything from a training exercise to an active operation. The fact that she was operating alone suggested either supreme confidence in her abilities or a mission that required absolute discretion. 3 blocks away, Jake pulled over and called Captain Williams' personal number, hoping she would answer despite the late hour. "This better be important," Williams said, her voice groggy with sleep. "I found her," Jake said simply. "She's conducting surveillance on a residence in the subdivision about 2 miles from Murphy's bar." There was a long pause before Williams responded. "Are you absolutely certain it's her?" "As certain as I can be without approaching directly," Jake replied. "Same woman, same posture, clearly watching something specific." "Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to make contact," Williams ordered firmly. "Return to base immediately and report to my office first thing in the morning, and don't discuss this with anyone else, including your friends." As Jake drove back to base, he realized that his casual encounter at Murphy's bar had evolved into something much more significant. Whether by accident or design, he had stumbled into the orbit of one of the military's most mysterious figures, and the implications of that discovery were only beginning to unfold. The next morning, Jake arrived at William's office to find her already deep in conversation with two men in civilian clothes who radiated the unmistakable aura of federal agents. The sight of them confirmed his suspicion that his discovery had triggered interest at levels far above his normal chain of command. "Staff Sergeant," Williams said formally as he entered, "these would like to discuss your recent observations." As Jake took a seat across from the agents, he realized that his simple attempt to understand what he'd missed in reading Sarah had led him into a world where the stakes were higher, and the rules more complex than anything his Marine training had prepared him for. Special Agent David Carter was the kind of man who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a government training manual. Everything about him was precisely controlled, from his charcoal gray suit that fit perfectly without seeming expensive, to his neutral expression that revealed nothing while missing nothing. His partner, Agent Jennifer Brooks, carried herself with the same professional detachment, though Jake detected a sharp intelligence behind her measured gaze that reminded him uncomfortably of Sarah. "Staff Sergeant," Agent Carter began, opening a thin manila folder that contained what appeared to be Jake's complete military record. "Your service record is impressive. 2 combat tour, multiple commendations, a reputation for reliability and discretion. That's why we're hoping you can help us with a sensitive situation." Jake glanced at Captain Williams, who gave him a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. "I'm happy to assist in any way I can, sir." "The individual you encountered at Murphy's Bar has been a person of interest to multiple government agencies for several years," Agent Brooks explained, her voice carrying a slight Southern accent that seemed at odds with her crisp federal agent demeanor. "We believe she may be operating in this area for reasons that could impact national security." "What kind of reasons?" Jake asked, though he suspected they wouldn't give him a straight answer. Agent Carter leaned forward slightly, his expression remaining neutral. "That's classified above your current clearance level, Sergeant. What we can tell you is that her presence here represents either a significant threat or a significant opportunity, depending on her intentions." "You want me to make contact again?" Jake realized, understanding the real purpose of their visit. "We want you to continue your normal routine," Agent Brooks corrected carefully. "If another encounter occurs naturally, we'd like you to be prepared to gather specific information without arousing suspicion." Captain Williams spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "The sergeant has no training in intelligence gathering or counterintelligence operations. You're asking him to engage with someone whose capabilities we can't fully assess." "Which is precisely why this approach might work," Agent Carter replied. "She's already established contact with Sergeant in what appeared to be a casual social setting. Any attempt to insert a trained intelligence operative at this point would likely be detected and could compromise whatever operation she's conducting." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension at the prospect of seeing Sarah again. "What exactly are you hoping I can learn?" Agent Brooks consulted a small notebook before responding. "Her current operational objectives, the scope of her surveillance activities, and most importantly, whether she's operating independently or as part of a larger organization." "What makes you think she'll tell me any of that?" Jake asked. "She won't tell you directly," Agent Carter explained. "But someone with her training can't help but reveal information through their behavior, their questions, and their reactions to specific stimuli. We'll provide you with techniques for eliciting responses that could prove valuable." Over the next 2 hours, Jake received a crash course in basic intelligence gathering that felt surreal in its contrast to his normal military training. Instead of learning to destroy enemy positions or coordinate tactical movements, he was taught to read microexpressions, to ask questions that seemed casual but provided strategic information, and to remember conversational details that might prove significant later. "Remember," Agent Brooks emphasized as the session concluded, "your primary objective is to remain safe and uncompromised. If at any point you feel the situation is becoming dangerous, extract yourself immediately and contact us. Someone with Black Mamba's reputation didn't earn it through charitable work." That evening, Jake returned to Murphy's Bar with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that reminded him of his first day of combat training. Everything looked the same neon beer signs, the same classic rock playing from the jukebox, the same mix of military personnel and locals. But Jake's perspective had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a Marine unwinding after work. He was an intelligence asset conducting a classified operation. Sarah was there, sitting in her usual spot at the bar, wearing dark jeans and a forest green sweater that complemented her complexion. She appeared to be reading something on her phone, but Jake noticed that her position allowed her to monitor both the entrance and the emergency exit simultaneously. "Sarah," Jake said, approaching with what he hoped appeared to be casual confidence. "I was hoping I might see you again." She looked up with that same assessing gaze he remembered from their first encounter. "Jake, you're becoming predictable in your unpredictability." The comment was cryptic enough to suggest she'd been monitoring his movements, which aligned with the agent's suspicions about her surveillance activities. Jake slid onto the adjacent stool, ordering a beer while trying to appear relaxed despite the weight of his hidden agenda. "Predictable how?" he asked, employing one of the questioning techniques Agent Brooks had taught him. "Most people, when they have an encounter that challenges their worldview, either dismiss it entirely or become obsessed with understanding it," Sarah replied, taking a small sip of what appeared to be the same whiskey she'd ordered during their first meeting. "You chose obsession, which tells me something about your character." "What does it tell you?" Sarah turned to face him fully, and Jake felt the same unsettling sensation of being thoroughly evaluated. "That you're intelligent enough to recognize when you've encountered something beyond your experience, but confident enough to pursue understanding rather than retreat into denial." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. "It depends on what you plan to do with that understanding," Sarah said. "Some knowledge carries responsibilities that not everyone is prepared to handle." The conversation felt like a chess match where Jake couldn't see all the pieces on the board. Every statement seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning, and he found himself struggling to maintain the casual demeanor his handlers had emphasized. "You mentioned last time that I missed things when I was reading you," Jake said, deciding to address their previous conversation directly. "I've been thinking about that, wondering what someone with your experience notices that I don't." Sarah smiled slightly, and for a moment her carefully controlled facade seemed to relax. "You see tactics and immediate threats, which is valuable in your line of work, but you miss the broader patterns, the long-term strategies that shape how situations develop." Such as? "Such as the fact that Murphy's bar has been under surveillance for the past 6 weeks," Sarah said casually, her tone suggesting she was discussing the weather rather than a potential security operation. Jake felt his pulse quicken but tried to maintain his composure. "By whom?" "Multiple parties, actually," Sarah replied, apparently enjoying his discomfort. "Federal agents conducting their own investigation, military intelligence gathering baseline data, and at least one foreign operative who's been photographing license plates in the parking lot." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Not only was Sarah aware of the surveillance, but she'd also identified multiple intelligence operations that he'd been completely oblivious to. His supposedly covert meeting with the federal agents suddenly seemed naive and transparent. "You know why I'm here," Jake said, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "I know why you think you're here," Sarah corrected. "The question is whether you understand why I'm really here." Before Jake could respond, Sarah stood and placed money on the bar, the same precise amount she'd left during their first encounter. "Walk with me," she said, heading toward the exit without waiting for his response. Jake followed, his training warring with his curiosity. Agent Brooks had emphasized extracting himself from any situation that felt dangerous, but Sarah's behavior suggested invitation rather than threat. Outside, the evening air was cool and crisp, with a clarity that made the surrounding area seem more vibrant than usual. "The federal agents who briefed you this morning are investigating a weapons smuggling operation that they believe involves personnel from camp," Sarah said, as they walked slowly through the parking lot. "They think I'm either part of the operation or investigating it independently." "Are you?" Jake asked, his directness surprising himself. "I'm here because someone is using military resources to facilitate arms transfers to organizations that threaten American interests overseas," Sarah replied. "The question is whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Jake stopped walking, the implications of her statement settling over him like a heavy weight. "You think someone on base is involved in weapons smuggling?" "I know someone on base is involved," Sarah corrected. The surveillance you observed the other night was confirmation of a supply chain that runs through that residential neighborhood to the base, and eventually to buyers in 3 different countries. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked, genuinely confused about her motivations. Sarah turned to face him, and in the parking lot's harsh lighting, Jake could see a weariness in her expression that hadn't been visible in the bar's dim atmosphere. Because the federal investigation is compromised. Someone inside the system is feeding information to the smugglers, which means traditional law enforcement approaches won't work. And you think I can help how? You have access to base personnel records, duty rosters, and transportation logs that would take me weeks to obtain through other means, Sarah explained. More importantly, you have a reputation for integrity that makes you unlikely to be compromised by the same forces that have corrupted the federal investigation. Jake stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was suggesting. You want me to conduct unauthorized intelligence gathering against my own unit. I want you to help identify traitors who are using their military access to arm America's enemies, Sarah replied firmly. The choice of how to frame that mission is up to you. As they stood in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights, Jake realized that his encounter with Black Mamba had evolved far beyond a chance meeting or even a federal intelligence operation. He was being recruited for something that existed in the shadows between legitimate authority and necessary action, where the rules were different and the stakes were potentially life and death. What happens if I say no? Jake asked. Then you go back to your normal routine. The federal investigation continues its compromised course, and eventually more American weapons end up in the hands of people who will use them against American interests, Sarah replied. No judgment, no consequences for you personally, but the problem doesn't go away. And if I say yes? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it seemed completely genuine rather than calculated. Then you get to find out what you're really capable of when the mission matters more than the protocol. As Jake considered her offer, he realized that his decision would define not just his immediate future, but his understanding of who he was and what he stood for. The comfortable certainties of military life were being challenged by the complex realities of a world where threats came from within as well as without, and where doing the right thing sometimes meant operating outside the official channels. I need time to think about it, Jake said finally. You have 48 hours, Sarah replied. After that, I'll have to pursue other options that won't require your involvement but might be more direct. As she walked away into the darkness beyond the parking lot's lights, Jake stood alone with the weight of a decision that could change everything he thought he knew about duty, loyalty, and the true nature of serving his country. Jake spent the next 36 hours in a state of mental turmoil that affected every aspect of his daily routine. During morning PT, he found himself studying his fellow Marines with new eyes, wondering which of them might be involved in the weapons smuggling operation Sarah had described. The easy camaraderie he'd always shared with his unit felt strained by the weight of suspicion and secret knowledge. You're being weird again, observed as they completed their final set of pull-ups on the base gym's exercise equipment. Ever since you started going back to Murphy's bar, you've been acting like someone who's carrying state secrets. The irony of his friend's observation wasn't lost on Jake, who was indeed carrying secrets that felt heavy enough to crush him. Just thinking about some things, he replied, toweling off the sweat that had accumulated despite the relatively light workout. Things like that mystery woman who claimed to be Black Mamba, asked, joining their conversation as he finished his own exercise routine. Because if you're still obsessing over her, you might want to consider that she could have been pulling your chain for entertainment. What if she wasn't? Jake asked, the question emerging before he could stop himself. What if everything she said was true and there are things happening that we don't know about? His friends exchanged glances that suggested they were genuinely concerned about his mental state. Who had been quietly listening while organizing his gear, finally spoke up. Look, we've all met people who claim to be more than they actually were. Hell, half the guys who wash out of special operations training spend the rest of their lives telling bar stories about missions they never actually went on. What makes you so sure this woman was different? Jake wanted to explain about the federal agents, the surveillance operation, and Sarah's detailed knowledge of base activities. But his instructions from Agent Carter had been explicit about maintaining operational security, which meant he couldn't share the information that would convince his friends he wasn't losing his mind. "Call it intuition," Jake said finally. "Sometimes you meet someone and you just know they're operating on a different level." That afternoon, Jake found himself in Captain Williams' office, ostensibly to discuss training schedules, but actually hoping to gain some insight into his impossible situation. "The federal agents who visited yesterday," Jake began carefully, "did they provide any guidance about how to proceed if contact is reestablished?" Williams looked up from the paperwork she'd been reviewing, her expression shifting to the carefully neutral mask she wore when discussing classified matters. "They emphasized the importance of following established protocols and maintaining communication with appropriate authorities." "What if the appropriate authorities might be compromised?" Jake asked, remembering Sarah's warning about the federal investigation. "That's a serious allegation, Sergeant," Williams replied sharply. "Do you have specific information that suggests corruption within the chain of command?" Jake realized he was approaching dangerous territory, where his questions could be interpreted as accusations against superior officers or federal agents. Hypothetically, what would be the proper course of action if a Marine discovered evidence of illegal activity that implicated people within the system? Williams studied him for a long moment, her analytical mind clearly working through the implications of his question. "Hypothetically, a Marine's primary obligation is to the Constitution and the American people, not to any individual or organization. If that obligation required action outside normal channels, history has shown that sometimes extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary responses." Her answer was carefully crafted to avoid any direct encouragement of unauthorized action, while acknowledging that such action might sometimes be necessary. Jake understood that she couldn't provide explicit guidance, but her words suggested that she understood the complexity of his situation. That evening, Jake returned to Murphy's bar one final time, knowing that his decision would have to be made before Sarah's 48-hour deadline expired. The bar was busier than usual, with several groups celebrating someone's promotion and a crowd gathered around the pool table watching a heated tournament. Sarah was there, sitting in her familiar spot but facing the room rather than the bar, a position that allowed her to monitor the entire establishment. She was dressed differently tonight, black slacks, and a dark blue blouse that somehow managed to look both professional and casual simultaneously. "Last night," she said as Jake approached, not bothering with preliminary greetings. "Last night," Jake confirmed, taking the stool beside her. "Before I give you an answer, I need to know something. If I help you, what happens to the federal investigation?" Agent Carter and Agent Brooks seemed genuinely concerned about national security. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Jake detected a hint of approval in her eyes. "The federal investigation will continue, but with accurate information instead of the carefully crafted misinformation they've been receiving. Sometimes the best way to help law enforcement is to ensure they're chasing the right targets." "You're going to feed them intelligence." "I'm going to ensure they have access to the truth," Sarah replied. "What they do with that truth is their decision." Jake considered this for a moment, weighing the moral implications. "And if I refuse to help you?" "Then I'll gather the information through other means, which might be more visible and could compromise both the federal investigation and ongoing base operations," Sarah explained. "Your assistance would allow for a surgical approach that minimizes collateral damage." "Who are you really working for?" Jake asked, voicing the question that had been bothering him since their first conversation. "This doesn't feel like a standard military operation." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, apparently debating how much to reveal. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of experience that made Jake realize he was glimpsing something few people were ever allowed to see. "There are threats to American security that operate between the cracks of our official institutions," she said finally. "Foreign intelligence services, terrorist organizations, and criminal networks that exploit the boundaries between military, law enforcement, and intelligence agency jurisdictions. Someone needs to address those threats when they fall outside everyone's official mandate. And that someone is you. That someone is a very small group of people who have been granted authority to operate in those spaces where traditional oversight might prevent necessary action," Sarah replied. "We're not rogue agents or vigilantes. We're accountable to the highest levels of government, but we operate with the flexibility to do whatever is necessary to protect American interests. Jake felt a chill of recognition at her words. She was describing a level of government authorization that existed in theory, but was rarely acknowledged in practice. The kind of operations that would be by everyone involved if they ever became public. The weapons smuggling operation, Jake said. How long has it been going on? At least 18 months, Sarah replied. Possibly longer. Someone with access to base weapons storage has been systematically diverting small quantities of firearms and ammunition to a distribution network that eventually supplies anti-American organizations in the Middle East and Africa. Small quantities, small enough to avoid triggering normal inventory controls, but large enough to make a significant impact over time, Sarah explained. A few rifles here, some ammunition there, gradually building into substantial weapons transfers that have already been used against American personnel overseas. The revelation hit Jake with the force of a physical blow. The idea that his own base might be inadvertently arming America's enemies made his decision suddenly clear. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Sarah reached into her purse and a small device that looked like a standard USB drive. "This contains software that will copy specific data from any computer it's plugged into. I need you to access the base logistics system and download transportation records, inventory reports, and personnel assignments for the past 2 years." Jake took the device, nodding its surprisingly lightweight. "This is illegal on about 12 different levels." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply, "but so is selling American weapons to people who use them to kill American soldiers." "How do I know this won't be traced back to me?" "Because the software creates false audit trails that will make it appear the data was accessed from multiple terminals by different users," Sarah explained. "Even if someone discovers the intrusion, they won't be able to identify the source." Jake pocketed the device, feeling its weight like a lead sinker despite its actual lightness. "When do you need this done?" "Tonight, if possible," Sarah replied. "The federal investigation is moving faster than I anticipated, and I need to ensure they have accurate information before they make arrests that could compromise the entire operation." "Tonight," Jake repeated, the immediacy of the timeline adding pressure to his already stressed mental state. Sarah stood to leave, but paused to place her hand briefly on Jake's shoulder. The contact was light and professional, but Jake felt an unexpected warmth that reminded him that beneath her legendary reputation, she was still a person carrying tremendous responsibility. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know this isn't easy, and I know the risks you're taking, but sometimes protecting your country means operating outside the systems designed to protect it." As she walked away, Jake sat alone with his beer and his decision, knowing that the next few hours would either mark him as a hero or a traitor, depending on who was making the judgment. 2 hours later, Jake found himself in the base administrative building using his after-hours access card to enter the logistics office. The building was nearly empty except for a few staff personnel working late shifts, and Jake's presence wouldn't attract unusual attention since he occasionally worked evening hours on training schedules and equipment requisitions. The computer system responded exactly as Sarah had predicted, the USB device automatically executing programs that vast amounts of data while creating false records of access. Jake watched the progress bar advance with a mixture of fascination and terror, knowing that each percentage point brought him deeper into a world of classified operations and potential consequences he couldn't fully comprehend. When the download completed, Jake removed the device and made his way back to his quarters, where he sent a brief text message to the number Sarah had provided. Within minutes, he received a response indicating a meeting location and time for the following evening. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of normal activities that felt surreal in the context of his secret mission. Jake attended briefings, conducted training exercises, and shared meals with his friends, all while carrying knowledge that could potentially expose a network of traitors and alter the course of a federal investigation. When he met Sarah at the designated location, a quiet park several miles from the base, she was accompanied by 2 other individuals who radiated the same controlled competence that had first attracted Jake's attention. One was a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself only as Miller, while the other was a woman Jake's age who seemed to analyze everything around her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. The data you provided confirms our suspicions about the scope of the operation, Sarah told him after reviewing the contents of the USB drive on a specialized laptop. Staff Sergeant Phillips has been using his position in weapons maintenance to facilitate the diversions, but he's not working alone. Jake felt his stomach clench as he recognized the name. Phillips was someone he'd worked with on multiple occasions, a competent Marine with a clean record and a reputation for reliability. Who else? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Captain Robert Hayes in logistics coordination, and civilian contractor Michael Torres who manages transportation schedules, Miller replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone delivering an intelligence briefing. The federal investigation identified Phillips as a suspect, but they were unaware of the other participants. What happens now? Jake asked. Now we ensure the federal agents receive information that will allow them to build cases against all three individuals simultaneously, Sarah explained. Your role in this operation is complete, but I wanted you to understand the impact of your contribution. As Jake listened to the details of how his intelligence would be used to expose the weapons smuggling network, he realized that his encounter with Black Mamba had fundamentally changed his understanding of duty, patriotism, and the complex realities of protecting national security. He had moved beyond the comfortable certainties of following orders to the more challenging realm of making moral decisions in ambiguous circumstances. 6 weeks later, Jake watched from across the base courtyard as federal agents arrested Staff Sergeant Phillips, Captain Hayes, and contractor Torres in a coordinated operation that dismantled the entire weapons smuggling network. The official reports credited the federal investigation with identifying and pursuing all three suspects, with no mention of the intelligence that had made their success possible. Sarah had disappeared as quietly as she had appeared, leaving Jake with memories of an encounter that had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he served. He never saw her again, but occasionally he would notice subtle signs of ongoing security operations that suggested her work continued in the shadows between official authority and necessary action. The experience had taught Jake that sometimes being a good Marine meant more than following orders. It meant understanding the difference between the institution he served and the principles it was meant to protect, and being willing to act on that understanding when the situation demanded it. As he watched his former colleagues being led away in handcuffs, Jake realized that his jokingly asked question about call signs had led him into a world where the most important missions were often the ones that never appeared in official records, carried out by people whose greatest achievement was ensuring they were never recognized for their service. In the years that followed, Jake would sometimes catch himself scanning crowded rooms with the same alertness he'd first noticed in Sarah, watching for signs of the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary, knowing that somewhere in the world, Black Mamba continued to operate in the spaces between what was official and what was necessary, protecting a country that would never know her name.